Hi, everyone. Welcome to Systemic Oppression Requires Systemic Change, Recasting the Roles of Academic Libraries in Contemporary Contexts. Thank you to the Association of College and Research Libraries for bringing us here with you today. This presentation is a collaboration between Jennifer Brown, who also goes by Jen, undergraduate learning and research librarian and community manager at We Here, myself, Jennifer A. Ferretti, I also go by Jenny, art librarian and founder and principal of We Here, and creative director of our publication Uproot, and Charlotte Rowe, scholarly communications librarian and community manager at We Here. All three of us are also advisory team members for Uproot. If you feel so inclined, we invite you to follow/visit us on our platforms. We like to open this presentation by recognizing and offering gratitude to the Indigenous peoples who cared for the land that each of us inhabits, as well as the violence and genocide caused by colonization. Each of us will read whose land we're on, starting with Jen.
I'm on Gwich'in territory of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples.
I'm on the land of the Susquehannock, Netego, Netcoke, and Piscataway peoples.
And I'm on the land of the Rimutish Ohlone and Kumeyaay peoples.
All of these lands are still home to many Native American people. We'd also like to acknowledge the people forcibly kidnapped from Africa in order to be enslaved on these lands, their labor that built the economy of this city, state, and country. What we're offering attendees today includes a look at what We Here is, how it came to be, and how we are recasting roles, our vision of liberation, which is how we execute what we do. We'll take a look at how y'all are failing, so critiques of the profession, and we'll wrap up with some offerings or takeaways to be better. Before we can go into what We Here is, what we do and how we do it, first we have to address why We Here exists, which is a discussion of the racial past and present of libraries. A brief historical rundown provides context of this community, which was built out of necessity and exhaustion. In the article, Tripping Over the Color Line, The Invisibility of Race in Library and Information Studies from 2005, Todd Honma refers to the White Racial Project of the United States. Honma writes that the first major public library in the United States was greatly impacted by the social and political forces of the time, among them the urbanization of the United States, the increase in public services and social institutions to enhance a more informed citizenry, and the influx of immigrants into the United States, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe. I'll read this quote from that article. By advocating a democratizing mission for the public library, these Americanization programs only served those segments of the population granted access to US citizenship. The purposeful exclusion of citizenship to people of color, the result of convergent racist histories and conquest and colonization of Native Americans and Chicanos, the enslavement of peoples of African descent, and importation of Asian immigrant labor who were legally branded as aliens ineligible for citizenship, paints a very different type of historical narrative and illustrates the racial nature of US citizenship projects in general and library Americanization programs in particular. He goes on to say, in other words, through the promotion of this type of white racial socialization process, libraries were also guilty of perpetuating a corollary system of racial exclusion and oppression towards those who could not so easily shed the color of their skin and assimilate into the white racial citizenry promoted within the library system. So how are libraries historically white serving while also having this narrative of being open to all, no matter your racial, economic, or gender identity? And how does that history then become a barrier to the profession or further systemic oppression to those who are already in the profession? All important questions we should be asking and discussing, particularly, but not exclusively, those in leadership positions. There's a legacy of racial discrimination that has prevented folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color from entering libraries and the profession. Recognition must be especially paid to Black librarians, workers, and users for direct actions of desegregation and the building of separate branches in colleges and universities to serve the needs of the Black population. People like Joseph Jackson Jr., Albert Lassiter, Alfred Cook, Ethel Sawyer, Geraldine Edwards Hollis, Evelyn Pierce, Janice Jackson, James Sammy Bradford, and Meredith Anding Jr., students from Tougaloo College, who in 1961 staged a read-in at a whites-only Maine Jackson Public Library in Mississippi. First, the students went to Jackson's library for Black residents and searched for materials they knew were not available to them there. They then visited the whites-only library and began searching and reading materials for class assignments. The staff asked the students to use the library for Black residents. The students refused, and the staff called police. The students were arrested for breach of peace. There were actually 16 people involved in the action, but the others did not enter the library and served other roles such as lookouts. One might chalk up a whites-only library to something in this country's tragic, misguided, racist past, but stories in which Black and Latinx students and members of the community are asked to leave library spaces or are forcibly removed by security or police are not uncommon today. As Anastasia Chu, Fabazi Etar, and I write in a forthcoming chapter in Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Studies Through Critical Race Theory, which Jen will also talk about later on in this presentation, this type of treatment is so common in the Black community that a hashtag is associated with these instances, hashtag studying while Black. We write about two specific examples. In 2018, a Black library and information science student at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. was told he could not use the law library, which is untrue according to the policy, and the law student staffing the desk that day called campus safety to remove him. In 2019, in New York City, a Columbia University student went to Barnard College's library, as all Columbia University students are permitted to do so, and was physically detained by campus safety officers. I'll read an excerpt of a quote from our chapter here. These incidents show a general belief that library spaces are elevated spaces and that those considered unworthy should be prevented from accessing them. Acknowledgement and engagement with this history is critical for contextualizing the profession today. This is a part of our history, and that history impacts the present. Without acknowledgement and engagement, we're left glorifying the very little progress that has been made. The majority of you in attendance are probably familiar with the dismal demographics of the library profession as reported by the American Library Association, which is 87% white. These demographics must be contextualized by the racist history of this profession. Without that context, one could easily surmise that people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color aren't interested in the profession or don't see value in it. The profession seeks a similar absolution when leaders and workers talk about the pipeline problem, the theory that there simply aren't enough properly skilled members of underrepresented groups to hire. Library workers from academic institutions have actually said to me personally that people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color just don't apply to positions at their institution, so the whiteness of their staff is not their fault. Rather than examining recruitment efforts, salary, educational, and professional experience requirements, internal mentorship or guidance, etc., the blame is placed on folks of underrepresented groups. Not only is library and information science not racially diverse, but we have a gender issue as well. Because of the racial demographics, this impacts women of color most, with the majority minority being Black women. The American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations found that in 2010, while only 17.2% of librarians were men, they held 40% of library director positions in universities, 40%. So beyond demographics, what are the effects of racism within the institution and profession? One immediate thought that comes to mind, no matter what profession we're discussing, is if the profession excludes people, it will obviously be built on a system without that group or groups. These systems may not have ever accounted for anyone who wasn't white to begin with. For example, academic institutions like the one I work at was built exclusively for white people, as they restricted enrollment to whites only between 1895 and 1954, changed because of Brown v. Board. Now I'll turn it over to Charlotte, who will provide the brief historical background of We Here and what we do.
We Here started as a Facebook group in late 2016, having been in one-to-many meetings with white men in library and information sciences asking to join a project or effort that was for the community, but included no one from the community in which they wanted to serve. Jenny launched We Here as a Facebook group. And as only at her institution, Jenny wanted to connect, collaborate with, and create community for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in library and information sciences. Jenny and I met when we were both selected as Association of Research Libraries Fellows and attended the ACRL Symposium. The type of community Jenny experienced with program fellows and scholars during that time, as well as the community felt at Pratt Institute as a graduate student, was something she wanted to continue. Academia, libraries, archives, membership organizations were providing space where Black, Indigenous people of color could gather, but Black, Indigenous people of color community was not the sole purpose of these institutions or places. Jenny met Jen Brown during another key time in We Here's early life, the Association of College and Research Libraries 2017 conference in Baltimore. In addition to meeting Jen Brown, a few more consistent collaborators such as Sophia Lung were met there. The We Here community is Black, Indigenous people of color only, and for people who work in a library or archives or are currently enrolled in the Library and Information Sciences educational program. There is no degree or experience requirement in We Here. Some of you might be wondering why. We Here is BIPOC only, and considering how many white women asked to join our space, we'll explain why we are BIPOC only here. Many of us are onlys at our institutions, only person who identifies as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And even if we weren't, as Jenny mentioned earlier, we are in a profession where we are severely underrepresented. We need a space where we don't have to explain why something was a microaggression, racist, or hurtful. We need a space to celebrate our wins without having someone question why we are succeeding. Continuing as BIPOC only in our private spaces and growing into a public-facing entity has allowed us to continue centering our community, keep to our ethos and our mission to seek and provide a safe and supportive community for BIPOC in library and information science professions and educational programs, and to recognize, discuss, and intervene in systemic social issues that have plagued these professions both currently and historically. Whatever we provide publicly is fueled by what our private community wants. The We Here community has grown to include close to 3,000 members across 3 private platforms, and Team We Here now has 5 people, including the 3 of us and community administrators Crystal Chen and Nicolette Davis. In everything we do, we center Black, Indigenous people of color needs, priorities, and interests. In some ways, this makes things really simple for us as community managers. We ask ourselves, does this center Black, Indigenous people of color? And in some ways, it's a lot of work because you're constantly having to remove and reject white priorities, white desires, white privilege, and even white people who try to join spaces that are explicitly only for BIPOC community. Also, since whiteness is the default in our society, every move we make is interrogated. And in order for that to happen, we try to be as transparent as possible with our community. For example, we are not a dues paying member organization, and that's something we've avoided because 1, we don't want to be gatekeeping monetarily, and 2, we're not an association, and quite honestly, associations are legal trade entities and by their nature center the profession rather than people. So that's some background to understand what informs our ethos and our work, which to the general public looks like these 3 things: Uproot, the Community School, and We Reads. Uproot is a We Hear publication whose editorial team includes Megde Abebe, Joyce Gabiola, Sophia Lung, Jorge Lopez McKnight, and Christina Santiago. We're grant funded by Spark, who is really a model for what white allyship should be, and everyone is paid for their labor, the editors, reviewers, and authors. Everyone is Black, Indigenous people of color, and even the citations must be BIPOC exclusively, but it is open access and freely available for everyone to read. This is already very different from the professional publications that we're familiar with, which is modeled on the inequitable and colonialist labor of academia that pretends that it's not embedded in capitalist structures. So here's an example of a publication, which is a letter from Asian diasporic library workers to Asian diasporic library workers about the anti-blackness in our community, following the school library journal blackface cover. If you do not identify as Black, Indigenous, or people or person of color, if you identify as white, you might not notice what is refreshing about this letter, which is that the perspectives of both the authors and the intended reader audience is BIPOC folks. We are not considering the white gaze, and actually as one of the authors of the letter, I can tell you that what we considered was the Asian and Black diasporic audience specifically. So this is a very concrete example of how Uproot and We Here is not just centering BIPOC folks, but giving us an opportunity to center ourselves. The community school came out of our annual survey's response for more personal and professional development opportunities. The offerings range from 1-hour webinars to 4-week courses. Registration is open first and sometimes only to the We Hear community, and our events are typically oversold. Instructional designers of our community school events are Black, Indigenous people of color, and many are members of our private community. While the topics themselves aren't unique in library professional development as a whole, something like writing your personal annual review and strategic plan sold out incredibly quickly, which tells us that the perspective of BIPOC instructors tailoring their education to a BIPOC audience is incredibly valuable. I know that diversity is a hot topic and lens for professional development these days, and I think that's fantastic. I've attended so many valuable events this past year, but to be very frank, we're not here to say that racism exists and that diversity is important. While it's a crucial perspective, it's a very othering perspective. For example, when I'm with my family, I don't look around the room and say, wow, this household is so diverse. So the We Hear programming doesn't have to say that it's diverse. It doesn't have to say that we're Black, Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC, a term that I find myself using interchangeably throughout this presentation. But honestly, it just doesn't come up often in our internal conversations. We are changing the default perspective and helping ourselves to grow and learn and get the tools to be more effective as people and professionals. Lastly, these events are not free and the instructors are paid. In both the profession of librarianship and in our society at large, BIPOC labor is underpaid and often not paid at all. So it's important to us that everyone is compensated fairly for their work and that we are supporting and investing in the expertise of our community. You can see more transparency about finances and where money is going in the 2020 year-end wrap-up, which we'll discuss later. So Rereads launched at the end of 2020 and was founded by Nicolette Klein. And the team includes Jen Brown, Crystal Chen, and myself. Nicolette came to us with an idea to highlight and recommend BIPOC voices in literature because frankly, the current system of book review is very frequently pandering to the white, cis, straight, able-bodied gaze. And that gaze can often be actually harmful. So we set out to read and recommend books that gave us joy, literature that nourishes us. And the first collection included 51 books across 7 categories. And we've already had people tell us that they purchased books either for themselves or their libraries based on this list. We've had really difficult and rewarding conversations about tagging and categorizing because of course we're librarians, and also because we wanted to make visible the identities of the authors while also being respectful of how they identify themselves. We're also asking the We Hear community to hold us accountable and to let us know when a book might be problematic or harmful. Each book has a link to WorldCat and Bookshop because we want these BIPOC authors to be read and paid so that we can continue to hear from them in the cultural marketplace. Outside of our public-facing projects and programs, we also offer We Hear only events, including some community school events, family meetings where we discuss current topics within and outside library and information science, and we facilitate a mentorship program. So while these spaces aren't open to the public, we feel it is important to advertise the types of topics our community prefers to be spaces for members only. This comes out of the need for privacy, a way to bring our whole selves to a space without fear of reprisal. For example, we recently hosted the panel discussion, The Lived Experiences of Library Workers of Color Pursuing Doctoral Degrees, and Holding Space for Grief and Power, discussing the letter to Asian diasporic library workers, which we mentioned earlier as a publication in Uproot. Now, Jenny will illustrate how we execute.
So how we execute all of this work is our vision of liberation. For one, we're clear about our mission and values. In the short amount of time we've been operating as an entity, we've noticed patterns in the way people approach us. Many begin with how much they admire our work and then come with an ask. They want to support us, which has translated to transactional sponsorships that will benefit them because they will be associated with our brand, our work. Folks want to collaborate with us, which has translated into us doing work for them for free. People have wanted us to teach them, which typically translates to us putting together customized workshops that they have no budget to actually see through. These are not hypotheticals or hyperbole. These are actual asks and wants for which we have receipts for, badly hidden behind false politeness that exudes an air of dominance. The screenshot on this slide is an email response from me to a company we're sure the majority of you watching this virtual presentation have heard of or paid money toward as they work within library and information science. The company started out with how much they admire our work and let us know they'd be willing to pay us a couple $100s a month if we put their logo on our social media platforms. I'll read my response. Thanks for the kind words. We have to decline your offer because we believe this type of transactional sponsorship is more of a benefit to the sponsor than to us. On a conceptual long game level, it also doesn't align with our mission, which is to not only support folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color in library and information science professions, but to interrogate the very structure on which these professions are built. So what we're not doing is part of what we are doing. We're not participating in the normalization of free labor and calling it collaboration. We're not participating in transactional sponsorships where you get a bump from being associated with our name while we barely get enough to cover compensation for someone to lead an event. We've had some out there asks, but we also want to share the fact that we received some incredibly mindful requests as well. Even if we can't participate in an ask, we always appreciate people being forthcoming about things like budget or lack thereof and treating us as people. The grant from the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, also known as SPARC, that Charlotte mentioned earlier, is a great example of this. Another example of collaborative support and participation is our Patreon community, which I'll describe in a moment. Running an entity is very different from running a private space, and we try to do both effectively with care and compassion. Communication has been key to this work and takes the most amount of labor. So for example, as Charlotte mentioned earlier, we put together what will be an annual document illustrating what we were able to accomplish during our first year as an entity. The next few slides are mostly from this document titled the 2020 Wrap-Up. So our Patreon, a platform that allows creators to be supported on a monthly basis, began gaining its first supporters in 2020 when the country seemed to be waking up to the racism, bigotry, and state-sanctioned murder of Black folks in the United States. While we never solicited donations because we didn't feel it was appropriate to ask folks for individual financial support during COVID-19, a good amount of white folks called on other white folks to support us on this platform. In order to support We Here's Black community members through the double pandemics, COVID-19 and racism, which has disproportionately impacted Black lives, We Here prioritized Black members for these one-time grants and gave just over $11,000, funding which came directly from our Patreon. We truly cannot do this work without the help of our monthly sustainers and folks who make one-time donations to us through our website. As I touched on during the last slide, a large amount, if not the majority of our Patreon supporters are white people. In return, they not only support our work, but it's almost like a community within a community. We offer monthly Zoom discussions based around current topics. And the screenshot on the left is one example when we discuss Black History Month. We also offer a monthly list of what we're loving, tending, and growing, which we call the We Here mixtape. While our 500 plus supporters are amazing, these are individuals giving out of their own pockets. We can't rely on these donations exclusively because they're too unpredictable. Someone might need to reduce or cancel their support, which is completely understandable. We provided just over $1,200 worth of scholarships out of pocket for people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color to attend community school events. A few members of our community and white folks also donated scholarships separate from this amount. Additionally, we try to have multiple cost tiers for community school events because we understand not everyone has a professional development budget. Some people are paying out of pocket for professional development. We develop mission critical programming for the community school, which are typically events for We Here members only and cover topics considered to be of great importance to our community, such as mental health and well-being. Typically, compensation to instructional designers for mission critical events are subsidized by We Here rather than from revenue generated from enrollment sales. This is another example of what our Patreon supporters have helped us achieve. Between March and December 2020, we paid out $30,567 to our contractors, which included community school instructional designers, folks who applied for the COVID-19 microgrant, and folks who did graphic design work for us, all of whom identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Back to the topic of emails we receive, one email asked not only would we waive a fee for them to attend a community school event, but the person asked why we were even charging fees in the first place. We are normalizing paying by POC for their time, knowledge, expertise, and labor, and our fees to the public will not be waived. When we ask someone to lead an event, which consists of developing a presentation, sometimes developing additional handouts, teaching a group about a topic, and answering their questions, we do not see this as a professional courtesy. This is intellectual and emotional labor that deserves compensation. From our 2020 wrap-up, one of our main motivations to become an official entity was to pay our community for creating a better world within the library and information science professions. As Charlotte mentioned, too often we as people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color are overlooked, undercelebrated, underpaid, and not credited. In addition to paying contractors, we are also interested in having and sharing knowledge and offering guidance when our community seeks temporary or contractual work elsewhere. For example, teaching a course elsewhere or public speaking. We want to see people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color in library and information science eat, survive, and thrive, and recognize we cannot and will not be the only place we are paid. For this reason, we want to share what we've learned with our community about compensation and negotiation, because knowledge is currency. We need to have honest discussions about money, just like we need to have honest discussions about who is working in library and information science. Here I'll read this Todd Honma quote from the same article, Tripping Over the Color Line. And he writes, libraries like academia are historically white serving, have been complicit in the white racial project of the United States during the 19th century, and perpetuate racial inequity in the field today through mechanisms such as unpaid labor. So I'll repeat what I said in the last slide. We need to have honest discussions about money, just like the recent hashtag publishing paid me, where disparities between men and women, people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and white folks were revealed through those honest numbers. Our profession desperately needs this. Note that hashtag publishing paid me was offered by individuals, not by publishing companies. Speaking of labor, the evolution of We Here has been organic, but not without hours upon hours of labor. We have to acknowledge that while we are out here trying to get people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color paid, we are not adequately compensated for this labor. We are devoted to this work, but we've sacrificed a lot to be here. Every person on Team We Here has a full-time job, and we are not regularly compensated for the work we put into this community and business. We put in hours between life and jobs, in the evenings and on weekends. So again, as Charlotte mentioned, our members do not pay dues. We feel strongly that the opportunity to gather in community should always remain free. But because the dues paying structure is the norm, many folks within and outside of We Here approach us in this way. So We Here will not save library and information science. There are 5 of us behind the scenes of, yes, an amazing collective power. But first and foremost, we are a community for people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Significant change must start on a local level, which may not garner significant attention, but has significant long-term effects. So now I'll turn it over to Jen Brown to review how y'all are failing.
Now, we've talked about the racist history of libraries and how We Here operates against those systems, but our work doesn't occur in a vacuum. When we consider how academic libraries should recast themselves, we have to acknowledge the profession's failings, to call out its unjust treatment of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples, its horrific policies, inadequate pay, and white supremacy workplace culture. None of this is a secret, and none of it is new. To start, we need look no further than academia's response to the current pandemic. Fobazi Achar's pivotal term, vocational awe, is defined as a set of ideas, values, and assumptions that librarians have about themselves and the profession, which results in libraries being seen as inherently good, sacred, and therefore beyond critique. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, some academic and public libraries responded to perceived notions around public need at the expense of Black, Brown, and Indigenous frontline workers. Consider who was first asked to report back to campuses after historic stay-at-home orders were initiated across many states. Now, vocational awe justified this labor, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color frontline workers were expected to put their lives on the line for library services. Of course, this matched the national trend of essential workers bearing the burden of keeping critical services running. New research is emerging every day in this area, but when we consider 2019 data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, which revealed that only 19.7% of non-Hispanic Black and 16.2% of Hispanic workers reported being able to work from home prior to the pandemic at all. It contextualizes the stark COVID-19 infection and death rates among communities of color. Libraries played a part in this due to racial disparities among employees in our field. But even before the pandemic, our profession regularly risked the mental and emotional health of staff of color. Ellen Ogihara, a former research and instruction librarian, resigned from St. Olaf College this past January. In an open letter that we should all be reading, she details her experiences using words that feel all too familiar. Over the last 2 years since I began this position, she says, the environment at the college and within the libraries and IT has become increasingly hostile. And as a person of color, I no longer feel safe or welcome at this institution. Her experience is a sorrowful reminder of how institutions traumatize Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and drive us from this field. It's a reminder of how, as Ellen so aptly puts, we become, and I quote from her open letter, heavily responsible for the legwork of making change, then scolded for making white colleagues uncomfortable. Her words remind us that the profession is failing to retain staff of color in the face of systemic racism. And if our primary institutions aren't failing us, then affiliated associations probably will. BIPOC library workers who undertake professional service efforts like serving on national committees or writing scholarly articles regularly face the things like the anti-Black racism that Peace Awesome Williamson, Jamia Williams, Zan Goodman, Christian I.J. Minter, and Ayaba Logan faced from the Journal of the Medical Library Association late last year. After a statement from the African American Medical Librarians Alliance Caucus of MLA was released on June 1st, 2020, stating that the undersigned were tired of not being seen, heard, included, or appreciated for the value that their unique voices, experiences, and perspectives bring to the narrative. The Journal of the Medical Library Association released a statement of their own in response. They wrote that they would do more to amplify the voices, experiences, and perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. After submitting a proposal, the 5 aforementioned Black librarians were invited to write an editorial for JMLA, addressing anti-Blackness in librarianship, only to experience it themselves, to have their words controlled and their narrative co-opted, to have whiteness centered and their attempts at challenging white supremacy within the article itself undermined. Much of what they experienced is publicly available, written in their own words, and we encourage everybody to read about their experience. We've deliberately said their names here as a way to thank them for their incredible courage and bravery, and so as not to erase their work. But this kind of racism is not isolated. It is the norm. Now, the profession's racist failures only worsen its other issues, especially those around professional development and affordability. Lacking cost-affordable options for community gathering, our field tends to disadvantage workers who are already economically marginalized when it comes to attending conferences, events, and annual meetings. Now, ACRL has been a wonderful advocate leading up to this presentation. Their efforts to fairly compensate, publicize, and technologically prepare us for this process were greatly appreciated. We're also grateful for their efforts to open up ACRL webinars and associated resources to non-members, as we've seen them do increasingly over the last several years. But we can't get up here and not be real. Affordability affects the professional development efforts across librarianship, And the number of times that Jenny, Charlotte, and I heard our colleagues of color say they couldn't afford to see us speak today, or where we witnessed accepted presenters having to pull their presentations due to prohibitive registration costs or lack of professional development funding, well, that stayed with us. To do transformative work like paying Black, Indigenous, and employees of color for their labor, as We Hear does, requires capital. We understand that firsthand. Entities cannot operate at a loss while also paying for conference infrastructure like Zoom and captioning services. But when the cost of sharing knowledge is so prohibitive that whole communities are left out, it demands reconciling. It demands a commitment to change, a commitment to acknowledging capitalism's constraints while finding ways around them. We consider this a call to action for all major academic conferences. And lastly, and most importantly, we have to talk about silence. Things left unsaid amid the United States' fascist regime in the face of an executive body hell-bent on criminalizing and caging brown and Black bodies in the name of greatness. Higher education institutions, along with their libraries, were notably silent after last September's executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, which, as you may remember, attempted to outlaw critical race theory and other critical pedagogies from government grounds. As Professor Hassan Kwame Jeffries wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I quote, "If we assume the best in our academic leaders, their silence can be interpreted as an attempt to protect the flow of federal dollars to their institutions. They aim to keep colleges clear of the order's blast radius long enough for a new president to clear away the debris. But regardless of endowment," he adds, "silence is shameful." And we add that your silence, particularly those of library leadership, will always mean complicity. Now, we've laid bare a truly small sampling of librarianship's most harrowing and recent stories, accounts of the Academy's white supremacist history, positioned beside We Hear's mission. And that's really what all of this has been, stories, tales that should quake the very foundation of our Academy and make you look at your role in these systems of oppression. But like the feminist writer Alice Walker said in a recent talk that I devoured, stories are but offerings, and offerings can provide nourishment. Of course, they can also be refused if this tea feels a little too hot for you today. But we'll close this talk by offering possible solutions, and we hope you listen. We hope you try, at least. As we're recasting the roles of academic libraries, I'll turn it back over to Jenny to talk about where we might begin.
First, break up with capitalism and white supremacy. Avoid the temptation to use vocational awe as a tool for recruitment, retention, and expectations. This is sticky work. It's long and it requires deep, thoughtful analysis of systems we've long taken at face value, such as wages and what it means to pay paraprofessionals less. When Black and brown labor so often comprise it, it means understanding that our capitalist conception of wages earned and the value we ascribe to certain kinds of labor, quote, has been the impetus for, as Barbara Ransby puts it in her talk on intersectionality and capitalism, and I quote again, "The horrific Atlantic slave trade, the inhumane genocide against Indigenous peoples in the Americas, and the colonization and pillaging of nearly half the planet," end quote. It means asking why leadership roles are overwhelmingly filled by white men, why divisions exist between paraprofessional and librarian roles, when the majority of paraprofessional labor is staffed by multiple marginalized brown, Black, and Indigenous people. It means study and personal examination of the ways you've been complicit in systems of harm against those you claim to value.
Now, this conference is all about open futures, but if we're going to look closely at what we're doing, think about how open leads into things like concepts of manifest destiny and colonialism, how the bleeding of boundaries led to things like consuming resources and stealing the land of Indigenous peoples, first and foremost. And this is not an exaggeration. High Country News has located more than 99% of all Morrill Act acres, identified their original Indigenous inhabitants and caretakers, and researched the principle raised from their sale in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Land grant universities, or land grab universities, according to their report, includes, quote, approximately 10.7 million acres taken from nearly 250 tribes, bands, and communities through over 160 violence-backed land secessions, a legal term for the giving up of territory. And this land actually continues to generate revenue through, for example, leases for drilling and mining rights. While the book we're showing, The Color of Law, reflects on the American government's complicitness in redlining, we know that academic institutions, and thus academic libraries, are part of campus expansion efforts that constantly eat into surrounding neighborhoods for the sake of open boundaries, progress, and other colonialist euphemisms. We should ask ourselves what it means to work alongside campus and larger communities to do good work, regardless of institutional affiliation, whether public or private. Institutions need to see themselves as part of that community, and library leaders should advocate for this whenever possible.
To that end, don't ignore local grassroots legislation and social projects happening around your campus. Our students often lead the way, as Black students did at my institution, the University of California, Berkeley, to get Proposition 16 onto California's November 2020 ballot. This proposition would have, quote, reinstated the ability to consider race and sex in government hiring, contracting, and in public university admissions, end quote, which would have allowed institutions statewide to enact racially just hiring and retention practices. While the proposition didn't pass, its arrival was a reminder that institutions must choose when to stand with our community legislation and social projects and so much more. And our final offering comes from the righteous forthcoming book, Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Studies Through Critical Race Theory, which is edited by Sophia Leung and Jorge Lopez McKnight. We can say with our full chests, you need to read this entire book. But in our specific chapter titled Leaning on Our Labor, Whiteness and Hierarchies of Power in LIS Work, Marisa Mendez-Brady, Nikolai Klein, and myself dreamt up possible solutions to the very systemic issues that our talk has covered today. To recast ourselves in that same spirit of liberation that Jenny alluded to earlier, our final calls to action suggest that you reflect critically on Western capitalist labor practices and hegemonic whiteness. And if you don't know what those terms mean, start by doing your homework and researching. Second, that you provide fearless library leadership without meaningless platitudes, particularly those of you who are AULs or ULs. Recasting anything tends to start with you. And lastly, increase transparency around salary, pay, and career advancement. For too long, we've subsisted on the meager idea that prestige, like working at a specific institution or even attending conferences like ACRL, is enough of an incentive to be here. But prestige will not feed us.
Now do better. And in the meantime, we'll take your questions and are prioritizing questions from people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And while we wait for those, we'll just show our thank you slides. Thank you so much.